Hello, 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 and it is time for another Composer Symposium. Um, and this one's probably going to be a little bit quicker, a little bit shorter than usual. So, yeah, because we got a lot of stuff going on, just with my son's birthday's coming up, and so I'm just going to make this one a quick one tonight. Hello, Devlin, Nick Devlin. Sorry, I had a friend named Devlin, last name Devlin, so I'm just used to saying that. But hello, Nick. Hello, Clark. Welcome. Hello, everybody. So yeah, go ahead and start posting your questions, and we'll see if we can get to them. Hello, Omar. Well, we are learning whatever we want to learn about. I generally leave these up to question and answers. It's just a way for people to come and ask about, whatever's troubling them musically or compositionally. So I see Nick has a question. Can I talk about voice leading? Yes, I can. Voice leading is really, it's an interesting subject, and I just finished reading a book, and I probably want to reread it by David Huron called Voice Leading. Actually, let me grab it. I think I've got it somewhere behind me. Hold on. Okay, so here is the book. This book is Voice Leading, the Science Behind a Musical Art. And what is really cool about it is that, for centuries we've had voice leading rules, these rules about what you're supposed to do when you're writing parts. And a lot of people have had issues with these rules, like they're just these stuffy, rules from the past that we don't really have to follow anymore. And what he shows in the book, and what we'll discuss right now, is really the goal of voice leading is to have perceptually independent parts that you can actually, like your brain and your ears can actually parse out of the music. So it is an extremely useful technique to have down as a composer, because if you don't, you're going to have trouble creating perceptually independent parts. And that's a big part of music. Being able to write a melody and being able to write a counter melody to it, or being able to write multiple parts in a harmony that all seem to work well together, that all have their own line and direction, and still sound good together. That's kind of the core of voice leading. Now, with voice leading, we have a few things that you think about really at the same time, and it's one is harmonic movement. So usually voice leading is connected with harmony, and you're thinking about the chord to chord what the harmonies that you're going to have are. And really the way we think about it is functional harmony is kind of the first thing that you should really be focusing on, understanding how one harmony moves from another. So let me go down here. So yeah, Nick, I see your question about it. Is voice leading related to counterpoint? Yes, they are, but we can talk a little bit about kind of the difference in what you're thinking about as well. So one thing you're thinking about, harmony, right? The actual movement from chord to chord. The next thing that you're thinking about is the movement of each individual note within the chord. And as a general, as like kind of the most basic thing to say about it is you generally want to have the least amount of movement. Now, obviously, that leads to very plain lines. And it's not that you always want the least amount of movement, but when you're striving for good voice leading, and let's say you've got three trumpets and they're playing in harmony, and they've got a line and they've got to harmonize something in the background, or maybe it's four horns and they're playing a pad in the background. You don't want them jumping all over the place. So you don't want block chords like this. What you want to do is you want to maintain common tones, right? So something like this. And you want to keep things generally in the same within the same range, not moving very far. So if you see this example versus what I've played in with kind of the big root blocky chords, you can see that's already a lot smoother. And so you just want to keep the movement as small as possible, usually by step, or more importantly is keeping the common tones. If you keep the common tones between chords, you'll probably not have that many problems. You'll still run into issues, and that's what a lot of the kind of finer points of voice leading is thinking about parallel octaves, parallel fifths, and just trying to keep things as clean as possible. The third thing that you're thinking about, though, when you're doing voice leading, or really almost all the time when you're doing music, when you're writing music, you're thinking about where the voices are going. So voice leading isn't just this independent practice; it does apply to everyday composing. But when you're practicing voice leading, that's kind of what we're thinking about right now. The next thing that you're thinking about is chordal doubling. So it's most common to have 4 notes in a chord, right? Even though there are 3 notes in a triad. And what that means is that you have to, unless you've got 7th chords, and even when you have 7th chords sometimes, you have to double certain notes. So if I were to play the roots down here, you can see here we got. Now, the easiest way to think about this, and he goes into rules on doubling and why there are actually different rules from different books and people have differing views. Your goal still is perceptual independence. And so the way I like to do it is just keep it as simple as possible. Generally try to double the root first. If you have to double anything, figure out if you can double the root. You can see here the root is doubled. I could take it up there as well. In this next chord, we double the root, right? Here, we double the root again. We got G and G down here. And then over here, once again, we doubled the root. Now, this style of voice leading right here and this style of playing is called keyboard style. And everything basically stays within an octave in the right hand. You don't have these large, this large spacing between the notes. So whereas if you're doing chorale style, one of these will get, let's see if I can cut that, change that. So you'll see something like this. Now, it doesn't change the fact that you're still trying to accomplish the same thing. You're trying to keep as little movement as possible. And here it actually is a little bit easier to see. You can see that each voice, it doesn't move very much. And in fact, any time that I could sustain a note through to the next chord, I've done that. And that leads to good voice leading. So yeah. Now, the other thing that you want to think about when you're doubling chords or doubling notes within the chord is generally I avoid doubling the third. Now, he goes into this, and it's not like a super hard and fast rule that you can never break. However, if you avoid doubling the third, usually it sounds good. So, for instance, if we have a first inversion chord, right? So we got the E down there. If I just play a little block chord right there, like a little block triad, right? It doesn't sound bad, right? So there's nothing, really that salient about doubling the third. I used to think that it was because it made it stick out, but really, I mean, if you listen to this, it's not like E is all of a sudden, the higher E is like piercing your ear. There's nothing like that. But I do believe that avoiding the doubling the third, especially when the third is in the root, it sounds a little richer. To me, to my ears, this or this sounds it just sounds a little bit cooler versus, it's not quite as resonant to my ears. So the other reason, though, is because the third often, if you've got a major chord, you may be thinking of that chord, either it's the 5 chord itself. So if we've got a G over here, let's do this. Right? You've got this B, because it's the leading tone, needs to go up to C. Right? So now in this case, we haven't doubled the third, and everything works out just fine. Now the leading tone, if you can within the inner voices sometimes go down to a not too tonic, right? So the leading tone can go down somewhere in inner voices if you have to, but generally you want to avoid that. You want the leading tone to follow its tendency and go up, just like you'd want the fourth, the F here, to go down to the E right there. And if I were to double the leading tone, so let's say this is a first inversion 5-7 chord, so this would be a 5-6-5 chord going to a 1 right here. Let me make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. You'll see that now we have parallel octaves. And the problem with parallel octaves is that you do lose the individual salient parts at that point. So this voice and this voice fuse into one kind of bigger voice, and you can't really tell the difference between the two of them. And because of that, and because the major goal for voice leading is perceptual independence of the lines, then you want to avoid doubling the leading tone. And if you just say, I'm going to avoid doubling the third in general, then you won't run into that problem nearly as often. So that's kind of voice leading in a nutshell. Obviously, it's often easier said than done, but on the other hand, if you're not too much of a stickler about it, the way I like to compose is not so much worry, and actually I think this is kind of all stretched out. Not so much worry about voice leading at the beginning. That's one of the later stage things that I worry about. So if you just follow those basic rules of trying to avoid doubling the third, being aware of where the leading tone is going, and trying to sustain common tones between different chords, and trying to have the least amount of movement, you're going to be like 80% of the way there, assuming you know how to use harmony in general. And so when you go back through your piece, once you're doing your fine-tuning, you're looking for mistakes, and you're really listening deeply to what you wrote, then you can go back and say, oh, you know what? I think there's parallel octaves here. I'm going to change that, or I don't like the resonance of this chord. And I rewrite chords all the time. I will write a chord and I say, you know what, this sounds kind of weak, because there's a big difference between, say, this sound right here. Oh, that's really low. Right? That's C, E, C, G, all kind of spread out really big. There's a big difference between that and that, or this, or even, a different inversion. So I find myself, all the time when I'm fine-tuning and moving back on my pieces, that I'm actually rewriting how I wrote the chords in the first place. So that's how I try to approach voice leading in general. So hopefully, Nick, that answers your questions. I would highly recommend David Huron's book if you're interested in voice leading. Although, to be fair, what he says at the back of the book, and this is a note to music theory teachers, people who are going to be teaching this material, is that he thinks you should just teach the skill first, and then anybody who's interested can come back and understand why the skill works the way, or why you learn the certain skills the way that you do. And he's got a lot of other stuff in there as well that's just really cool. He talks about the difference between kind of homophonic voice leading, right? So chorale style, kind of what we were looking at on the Sibelius, with everything moving at the same time, versus counterpoint. And really one of the biggest differences between that kind of voice leading and counterpoint is the rhythm. It's note onset. So the note onset, if I change this to that, right? Fundamentally, it's not really a different chord or anything like that, but the note onset is different, and you're going to hear this other line, very differently. In fact, maybe I can. Let's see. So, I know this is a really short example. Let me delete that right there. I wonder if I could. Well, no, probably not worth the effort right now. So here, all I did was syncopate everything. Let me scooch that. So here we go. Right, all I did was shift it over by a half step or by an eighth note, and doing that, it actually makes that inner voice much more palpable. Like you can really hear it, whereas before it just kind of merged with the harmony and it wasn't quite as individual. So that's really the core difference between just voice leading that you do chorale style and counterpoint. Now there's lots of style rules, I would say, with counterpoint that come into play that obviously are different than what you do for chorale writing. But I would highly recommend these skills for any composer, and a great book is the Aldwell and Schachter Harmony and Voice Leading book. It is very big, and it can be very dry to go through on your own. So I apologize to anybody who does go deep into it. It is a lot of work going through that book. But you will get very good at voice leading. And if you back it up with reading David Huron's book, you'll be able to answer the reasons why, like, for instance, you avoid parallel fifths, and parallel octaves. So, okay, let me back up here, look at other questions. Let's see. This is from Gautam Padada. Hopefully I said that right. I'm trying to make a list of all possible positions and colors that a given chord can move to. How do I list this? Well, I mean, really, any chord can move to any other chord in the right circumstances. It's just like painting. If you've ever studied painting, you'll know that there's no such thing as a bad color. It's just the wrong color at the wrong time. So I would say, just be methodical about it. And, well, there's two ways you could go about it. Listen to a lot of music, and when you hear a chordal movement that you like, sit down and try to figure it out. If you're listening to something and you hear something like this, and you're like, oh wow, that's kind of a cool sound. What is that? And you can sit down. You can be like, okay, maybe it's this. No, that's not right. And maybe it was no, that wasn't right either. Oh, there we go. It's a minor C minor moving to E flat minor, right? It's a minor chord moving up by a minor third, right? So you can write that down. What does that make you feel? What kind of colors and what kind of emotions does that evoke in you? Now, that's one way to go about it. The other way is to be, kind of systematic about it and say, I'm going to go from this chord to every other chord, right? And you can start with major triads. And you'll see this can be a little underwhelming. And it kind of goes to say that it really is circumstances, right? This sound, it's kind of like, nothing special, right? But if that happens at the right moment, like maybe you have just this quiet whatever, and you've had right now it has a very different feeling. So sometimes it's more than just the chord. It's everything about it. It's the accompaniment. It's the mood that you're setting. It's what came before it. It's what's coming after it. So I think the first method that I listed is just listening to music, and when you find something that you like, sit down and figure out why you like it, and also figure out what's going on around it. Like, what is it that made that stick out in your ears, If you keep hearing... right, then that's going to have a certain feel whereas it'll be different if it's right. It's kind of doesn't fit. It's a little bit different. It's odd feeling versus the other one where it kind of felt like it's dark, but they all fit together. So yeah, harmony is one of these things that it can be very personal the way you express your own harmony, and start building up a storehouse. There's obviously things that we can lean on. There's going to be these progressions that everybody knows. Right, that kind of stuff. Let's see. Whatever. Everybody's going to have their stock progressions that they like to lean on. So I would start building up progressions that you really like, write them down, have kind of like a little book that you can keep those things in and come back to when you're feeling like you don't have any good ideas. So I see you kind of have a follow-up question here. Any resources to approach this properly? Well, I mean, there's lots and lots of harmony books, obviously. There's I would say what's a little frustrating about harmony textbooks is that they're very thorough and very fundamental, and they let you build up these skills, but they don't give you some core stock progressions to go with. I'm doing some research right now, a little bit more kind of in-depth research on Partimenti, and Partimenti really has to do with these kind of more traditional ways of teaching composition, where students were expected to learn how to play figured bass first. You'd have just a note, and then you'd have a number, and you'd have to know what kind of chord to play. If it's an inversion, how does it match within the scale? You'd learn things like the rule of the octave, where you could harmonize just about any bass note that moves by step. And then you would also learn these little turns of phrases that sometimes they had names, sometimes they didn't. But most of the stuff was passed down orally, and it was lost really throughout the most of the 20th century. It's kind of nobody was really focusing on it till just the last decade or 2 decades or so. So I think there's going to be a lot of possibility. If you listen to my interview with Robert Yerdingen on my podcast, we talk about it. And I uploaded a PDF of this book called 1000 Harmonic Exercises. That's this old Russian book that really has a lot of really cool progressions in it, if you can spend the time to figure them out, because they are thorough-based. They're not. There's really no explanation, and there's only a few words in there, and I can't read Russian, so I have no idea what it says, in fact. But if you just open it up and you look at the progressions, especially as you get further down in the book, there's just really cool stuff in there. There's stuff that wanders from key to key. There's pages where it shows you how to modulate. So it's out there. And I think a big secret really waiting to be unlocked for modern composers are these Partimenti. I think there's going to be a flood of these things probably in the next decade as the research gets better and better, and people are uncovering them. They're figuring out how to teach them, the pedagogy that actually goes along with teaching Partimenti, with the problem of these being passed down orally for hundreds of years, and nobody writing down exactly how to teach them. When they stopped passing it down orally, then we lost a lot of the core knowledge that all great composers knew this stuff. Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Ravel, Debussy, they were all taught these. Stravinsky was even taught this stuff because it made its way up through Russia. That's where we get this 1000 Exercises book. So, but for some reason, and I don't know if it was like World War I and World War II that really kind of caused this to go away, or if it's just the way theory propagated through Germany and through United States and the way they like to teach harmony there, that it just was maybe pushed to the side and eventually forgotten. I don't know. I don't know the full answer for that, but that would be a great resource to look into. So, and if you listen to my podcast episode, I can't remember. I think it's episode number 11. But either way, Robert Yerdingen, I've got a link on that page so you can check it out. In fact, why don't I just find it right now? So, okay, let me look for, sorry, I had some audio feedback there. Let me see if there's any other questions. Okay, let's see. This is Kikistani. Would you have any tips for incorporating modes in part writing and secondary dominants more into my future pieces? Yeah, so, modal harmony, the traditional like church mode stuff is really about intervals. It's about understanding traditional modal counterpoint, and there's all sorts of rules for that, in terms of the kinds of movement you can have from one voice to another, the kinds of intervals that are allowed between two voices, how leaps are treated specifically. Now, there's that kind of modal writing that I would highly recommend Peter Schubert's book. It's the best book I've seen on modal counterpoint out there. It's called Modal Counterpoint Renaissance Style by Peter Schubert. You can look that up on Amazon. And but then there's the kind of more modern way of looking at modes, in that with a mode you are abandoning, in a sense, functional harmony. So if you pick a Dorian mode, right, you can treat it to where you're not so much worried about 1 has to move to 4, which has to move to 5, which then has to move back to 1 again, tonic, predominant, dominant, and so on. You're just kind of thinking about it color-wise, so you've got a little bit more freedom. So that's one way to think about modes, and then you can start experimenting with other modes, like Phrygian mode and things like that. And then let's see, what else did you write? Oh, and adding secondary dominants. So secondary dominants they really don't need to be that tricky for people. It's effectively, let's say you're writing a progression. Let me pull up Sibelius here. So, let's say you're writing just a simple progression. I'll start with some block chords. Just, let's see, I'll do this half notes. So if we do, let's say, 1, 6, why don't we do 2, and you can see how I do this. I'll show you kind of the voice leading process that I've got, because it's really doesn't have to be that complex. 2, and then why don't we do just 5, 7, and then 1, right? So we'll do that, and we'll throw some bass notes down here. Let's see, and we'll do 2, 6, 5, 1, like that. So now I'm going to just try to make it look like it's all staying in the same range, and that takes care of most of your voice leading. I mean, that's effectively piano style right there, or keyboard style. I mean, you can see I try to sustain notes as much as possible, or have the least amount of movement. Voice leading in a nutshell right there, super simple. Now, each of these chords, let me throw down the Roman numerals. So we got 1, 6, 2, 6, 5, 7. Why did it do that? Hold on. That's my thing here. That's 5, 7, and then 1. Now, each of these can be imagined as its own, it can have its own applied dominant, right? And you just have to imagine you're in that scale for a moment. So here we've got an A minor, right? And if you were in A minor, the 5 chord in that is an E chord, right? Or you could do E7. So we'll change this now to quarter notes. Put an E there. And then we'll just go, let's see, we'll probably want to keep it about right there. And now we've added an applied dominant, and you just write it as 5 of 5, or sorry, 5 of 6, like that. And so we got a 2 chord here, right? A 2-6 chord, and the 5, if we are in D minor, is going to be A, right? So it's the same concept, and it actually works out nicely here. We just go repeat, and we raise that by half step. 5 of 5. You can also do inversions, right? So I could do here, and if I've got a third, don't want to double it, change that to a root position 2 chord. So now let's listen to this. Before, the progression was 1 to 6. We'll change this to root position 2, 5, 1. And now let's listen with the applied dominance. So that's really how you use applied dominance. You're just, for a moment, you're just pretending that you're in that key. You're not in the home key anymore. You're not in C major in this case. We were pretending to be in A minor for a minute, or we were pretending to be in D minor for a minute. And that goes for any chord that you've used. If you've got a diatonic chord, obviously, then you can do the applied dominant for any diatonic chord, with the exception of, obviously, diminish. They don't have dominance because a diminish is not a key. There's a diminished scale. I know that. Obviously, we use diminished scales like improvising in jazz, right? But we don't have a diminished key. There's no key area. So there's no 5. If you do that, it's going to be kind of this weird. You'll have if you got a B, you got an F. I don't know. So everything else, though, 1, 6, 4, 2, 5, those all have applied dominance. 3 has an applied dominant. So anytime you have any of these chords, just think about, I can add an applied dominant here. I can squeeze it in, or maybe you could even substitute it. Like here, we probably can avoid using that all together and just do that. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, how to use applied dominance. If you've never checked out my harmony chart, and I know I've been talking about the newer one for a long time. The new one's in progress. It's not done yet, so I don't want everybody to see it. What's cool about this new one, though, I don't want to give away all the... No, it's fine. I guess I can just show everybody. It's kind of ugly right now. That's why I don't want to release it, because I'm working on this in Keynote. So it's not quite as cool as the other one, which was Photoshop. But it shows you how to modulate to any of the closely related keys. And then down here, using diminished chords, you can modulate to just about every key. And it's because a diminished chord evenly divides the octave, right? And so by evenly dividing the octave, it's only a half step away from a bunch of 7th chords. And when you're a half step away from a 7th chord, then you can easily jump to any root from there, because any 7th chord can sound like a 5 chord, which is cool, which means that, if you're just playing along, right? I just went this to 6 to A flat 7 to D flat major, right? Super easy. Anytime you hit any kind of 7th chord, and that's kind of a little trick too, something I pick up in jazz, and I see Kekstani gave me a super chat thing. Thank you very much. That is extremely helpful. Let me see. I don't know if you had any extra questions, but that is very nice. Thank you. One of the little tips that I picked up doing jazz is that it just seems like you can always jump to any 2-5-1 and it's always going to work out. You can basically just, as long as you resolve everything, it just always sounds like it was what you meant to do, even though it may, in the movement to the 2-5-1, feel kind of like an accident. So if I'm just, I just set us up and let's see, and then we've got right. I just jump to E flat minor, and kind of as we were listening earlier, that's got an odd feel, right? But as long as I resolve it, it still sounds like, oh, he meant to do that. It wasn't like a oopsie kind of moment. So So yeah. So okay, well, let me see if there's any other questions. Let's see. This is from Zach. I'm in music theory in high school right now, and I want to go into music composition for college. Any recommendations for how to get started with it? Well, yeah, Zach. Any way that you can build up your skills as much as possible now. College obviously is a place to learn, and I would say that. Give yourself a leg up by doing as much transcription as you can, like ear training. You'll be surprised, but ear training is going to make a huge difference. I mean, obviously, if you're doing music theory in college, you're probably going to have to do sight singing and training your ears. At least looking back for me, I think the transcription I did as a kid, just on my own. I just wanted to know what some music was, and it was kind of, we didn't have the internet at that time. This was like 1996 or 97, and we hadn't been hooked up to the internet yet. And so I wanted to get the music for something, and you didn't have every score that ever lived, all on IMSLP. So I'd just sit there and I'd write it out, or I'd play it, with my trumpet, which I had out here right now. I was playing earlier. But I think doing that actually gave me a leg up on a lot of the other students in the class, because I could audiate and I could conceptually understand in my head what the music was and what it meant, what the notes actually meant, more so than a lot of other people who maybe they did a lot of playing, but they didn't really stress their ears. They just maybe focused on the notation more so. So doing that, I would say, you don't have to necessarily pre-read any of the books or something, that they're doing. I would say just do a lot of composing. I mean, you're in a stage of life right now that you probably have a lot of energy, a lot of passion. Sitting down, listening to music that really inspires you, copy it out. Obviously transcription by ear is really good, but it's also useful if you want to copy scores. Sit down, find a piece of music that you like, and copy the score out by hand. You'll learn a whole lot by doing that. Take that piece that you copy out by hand, figure out what the core, like the skeleton of it is, right? What's the harmonic movement? What are the kind of core melodic tones? Turn that into a little skeleton and write some variations on it. You'll learn a ton doing that. I mean, these are little exercises that you can just sit down and do. You don't need a teacher for that. It's helpful to have somebody take a look. And, if you want to over the summer, keep showing up to the symposiums and send me your pieces. We can go over them here. I think it's fun for everybody. And I think that'll get you started on the right foot. Obviously, if you don't have the basics down, I hopefully you do have the basics if you're taking music theory in high school, but be solid on your reading different clefs. Don't just focus on treble clef. Make sure you can read at least bass clef too. Alto and tenor clef are useful. Alto especially, I feel like that's just one that you've got to learn. My alto reading is marginal. I mean, I can figure it out, but it always takes me a second, like, what is that again? Because I don't play viola. So, I probably should just start playing an instrument and just learn it in alto clef. I think that's the key, and that's something I've learned is when I read treble clef, I do the trumpet fingerings. Like subconsciously, I'm sitting there reading. I don't care what I'm reading. It could be for flute or piano or whatever. I think about the trumpet fingerings. But when I'm reading something with a bass clef, I actually think about how would I play that on piano. So I think there's something to learning that muscle memory with clefs that really make it stick out. So, if you could learn to play your instrument with any other clef, like an alto clef or tenor clef or any of these other obscure, Baroque clefs that they've got, shifting all over the place, that's probably going to be useful for you as well. But I would definitely make sure you know alto and tenor. I mean, sorry, not alto, tenor, treble and bass. So yeah, hopefully that gets you in the right direction. It's one of these things that, be clear with your teachers what you want to get out of the program and where you're going, and just try to be clear as much as you can. Obviously, goals change, but just try to be as clear as you can with what your goals are. I think that was a mistake that I made, and part of it was I didn't really know my goals back in college, but I did know that when I started college, I wanted to be a theory guy. right? I knew I loved to compose, and I also knew that I did not want to be a professional trumpet player. And I didn't relay that to my teacher enough, that my end goal was not to be a great performer, and that I had some issues with my embouchures. I just couldn't hang with the best trumpet players. And they kept pushing me and pushing me and pushing me towards performance. And I never really got a chance to compose. The composition teacher went on sabbatical my freshman year, so I didn't really get to interface with him. And the theory teacher he was a good theory teacher, but his thing was piano performance. He didn't really care that much about composition. And so I wasn't nurtured in the right way as a young composer at that time. So I think being clear to your teachers, get to know the other composers in the program, get to know people who can really help you, utilize the ensembles as much as possible, and be the one that really be the squeaky wheel. Go in there and find the good players. If you find a good violin player, say, hey, I want to write for you a solo violin piece, and get them to play it. And then find the best flute player and do the same thing, and go around and write for little ensembles and things like that. I mean, looking back, that's what I wish I had done, because I had more time than I knew what to do with back then, and I just didn't have the focus that I have now. So hopefully you can get that focus. And this is what I say, even if you change paths later on, it's totally fine. At this time right now, your goal is to be a composition major. Utilize the resources that you have as much as you possibly can, and I think you'll have a much better experience out of it than I did at the time. So hopefully that helps. Let me move on here to John Moffat. See, can you talk about the application of chromatic median chords, not necessarily used as secondary dominants? Yeah, so let me erase this stuff here. Chromatic median chords are chords that are related chromatically, so they're not diatonic, and they are related. They have a mediant relationship, which means thirds, right? So there's a couple of these ones. We got this, right? So these are kind of the core ones here, and you can also do minor chromatic medians, although I think they're less common often, because there's usually a little bit more voice leading involved, and you don't have the common tone between the two of them, so they don't work out as well. However, they are useful in the right circumstances. If you're doing film composing, they obviously they can have a very dark feel to them. Right? It can change the mood very quickly. But the core of chromatic medians is that you're thinking about same thing with the voice leading is you want to keep those common tones and have as little movement as possible when you're writing out the voice leading for them, right? And the other thing to think about is that they in a sense, they don't have a functional order, right? There's the syntax for chromatic medians is a lot looser than it is for standard diatonic harmony. I mean, if I play, everybody knows where I'm going to go with this, right? No, I'm kidding. You're going to go back to 1, right? 5 just is saying. But if I do a similar kind of movement, right? I'm just moving by chromatic medians here. I was moving by major thirds, 2 major chords. However, there's nothing saying that this one has to go, to another chromatic median. There's no like round the circle kind of feel to it. Even though you can navigate kind of around a circle with it. I mean, you can like go from key to key to key. However, you lose that syntax. And so it is a really great way to sustain things without losing boredom, and to get yourself out of diatonic harmony, and to modulate easily and quickly, in a little more direct fashion. You don't have to think about what's the common chord between the 2 keys. You don't have to sit there and be like, okay, well, if I want to go from C major to, A major, how am I going to smoothly do this stuff? You just, to just do it. So, and I think probably, the most memorable example that everybody thinks about is the opening to the Largo movement of the Ninth Symphony by Dvorak, the New World Symphony. It's just a really striking, cool thing, and it's simple, but I think it took somebody to do it. Like, you look back, you're like, oh man, I wish I had thought of that first. Obviously, I wasn't alive at the time, but it's so cool and so simple. But it's chromatic medians. I'm sure at the time it was like everybody was blown away. I mean, I'm still blown away by it. It's just cool music. Okay, so let's see. Oh wow, Zach, you've got perfect pitch. I just saw this comment, so you've got a huge leg up. I don't know what it's like to have perfect pitch. I wish I did. That would be really cool. But okay, let's see. Kikistani's got another question here. What are important thoughts to have on your mind when you're trying to start a composition? Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I go through all sorts of moods and all sorts of mindsets when I'm trying to start up compositions. And sometimes I get an idea and I want to stick with it. Sometimes I'm just noodling around the piano and something hits me. Sometimes I'm very focused and I'm doing kind of more of an exercise and I'm going to finish this thing no matter what. I'm going to lay out the form and I'm just going to write this. So, I think this is one of those things that probably you should experiment with and find out what works best for you when you're composing, and in a sense you can almost brainstorm a bunch of ideas on how to approach it. I mean, you can, and just test it out. So let's say that one test is going to be, you're going to spend 5 minutes, closing your eyes and breathing and meditating outside and just listening. Right? You're just going to sit there and listen. And if any ideas come, you're going to let it go. Right? And then at the end of those 5 minutes, you're going to sit up. You're going to walk to wherever you feel most comfortable to compose. Maybe it's at the piano. Maybe it's your DAW, whatever. I would have that ready to go beforehand. Maybe you compose with a trumpet or a guitar or whatever, a harmonica. Then you're going to sit down with your chosen medium of composition and just do it. Another one could be, you're going to roll some, compositional dice. Maybe you're going to kind of randomly pick 5 notes, and you're going to say, I'm going to try to do this. Almost kind of like creativity prompters. Another thing that I find really helps with mindset, and I think some people maybe won't like this because it encroaches on this idea that we all have to be super original and creative all the time, but listen to something that really inspires you. I feel like I've written some of my best music after listening to something that really gets me going creatively, like Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings. I listened to that, and I wrote some stuff for string quartet that I really enjoy. I like the piece that I wrote. I like listening back to it, and we're going to be recording it soon for a little film score. I remember listening to a piece. It was a piano piece. I think it was by Schumann. It was a Consolation number 3 or something like this. This was years ago. But then I wrote one of my nocturnes after that, and I really enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed the process, and I still enjoy listening to it occasionally. And I think it's because there was it kind of gets to the core of what it is that you really like about music. I mean, I love listening to music. I listen to so much music all the time. I feel like I'm always listening to music. Anytime I'm writing, anytime I'm working around the house, and a lot of times I just like to sit and listen, try to close my eyes, or often I like to read scores and listen. And if you're not taking advantage of, that's a big way to get inspiration. A lot of people ask, how do you get inspired to write music? Because sometimes you're just not inspired, but I would say connecting with the thing that actually inspires you the most about music will inspire you to write music. And in fact, I was just reading an article today. It was about beauty, and it was an interesting thing was that, they're not necessarily trying to say what is and what's not beautiful. And I guess they were kind of saying there's a lot of things that can be beautiful, but the core thing, the most important thing about it is that you actually have to be thinking about the thing that is supposed to be beautiful. And what they were doing is they were testing people. They had them look at images and rate whether they thought it was beautiful or not beautiful. You know, it was like a chair. You know, maybe they think it's nice, you know, but not beautiful, and maybe it's you know, a famous painting like the Mona Lisa, and they'll say it's beautiful. But then they also tested them with distractions. So they had like I think it was like a little iPad game that they were supposed to do, and then they would flash a picture and say if it was beautiful or not. And actually, less things were considered beautiful when they were distracted. And so a big aspect of beauty and you know, being inspired by things, I think, is actually just taking the time to think about it. Just taking the time to pause everything else, sit back, and listen to music or look at great art. And don't just think that by sitting here doing your homework and putting Bach in the background that you're really going to be absorbing that music in the same way and getting inspired in the same way. So yeah, that's kind of the things that go on in my mind when I'm sitting down to compose. Other times, I just have a deadline, right, with film scoring, and I just have to write some music, and I feel absolutely no inspiration whatsoever, and that's when I lean on my craft. And one of the ideas I had for a definition of craft, because I feel like craft is one of these words that's thrown around. I move that Sibelius there. Craft is one of these things that's thrown around, this word that not a lot of people talk about or really define well. And my idea for craft, and I throw these definitions out there, but I leave myself open to modifying definitions and changing them, is that craft is the stuff that you know, and you know how to use it, and you know it's going to work. So, for instance, you know, a simple example is, right, 5-1 at the end of a phrase, a cadence, right? Cadencing is a craft that you build up. You know the cadences, right? You know how to do a perfect, or this would be imperfect, authentic cadence. We're ended on 3 there, or right, perfect authentic, where you go from 5 to 1, and you've got 1 in the soprano, or it could be a plagal cadence. Right? Those are craft. Those are things that I know I'm going to use, and I know how to use them, and I know they're going to work in the way that I expect them to work. So I feel like that's a good definition for craft. So, okay, I can't even remember why I got into craft here. But either way, let me keep on moving here. I'm probably going to call this at about an hour, so I'll get to the last couple questions here. This is ABC space DEFG. Man, I have so many questions. I've been getting into Sibelius and actual stuff, and it's like a whole new world. I'm wondering what the actual steps are and how long it usually takes to complete. Let's see, I start writing the chord progression in blocks for the entire piece, then go back and add details and correct mistakes with voice leading. It takes a ton of time, though, like note entry. Let's see, I use HookPad to plan the overall harmony and modulations first. So yeah, there's no doubt about it. Composition can take a long time, especially if it's a long composition. And the amount, I believe, the secret ingredient to great music is time and effort. You know, some of the things that I feel, the best things that I've written have taken me the longest time to write. You may get these moments, these flashes of genius where you're like, this is really incredible what I just wrote. I just came up with the best basic idea, or this theme is amazing. But it takes a lot of time to take that and turn it into a finished product. And the more time that you spend on your piece, thinking about the voice leading, thinking about the part writing, thinking about the way things develop, it's going to be better. And I would say critical to that is really to be okay with cutting material, trashing what doesn't work, even if it's great. And it doesn't mean you have to get rid of it forever. Copy, paste it, print it out, write it out by hand, put it in your idea folder for Sibelius, whatever you got to do. You can hold on to those ideas, and I do recommend having books that you've got themes written out in, and places where you can find those. But yeah, I would just say, the amount of time that you put in your composition, it shows. If you pump out a composition in 1 hour and you say, that's it, I'm done, it's going to be a 1 hour composition. If you spend a week on that same piece, it's going to be a completely different level of composition. And if you spend a month on that piece, it's going to be even better. So at a certain point, I mean, I think it's gut feeling when you think you've reached the end of your composition. Nobody can really say when it's done. I mean, there's that famous line, art is never finished, it's only abandoned. And in a sense, you do have to say, okay, I've done it, and I'm happy with this. And I'm not a big proponent of going back and making changes in my compositions unless there's a need for that. If you're publishing and you want to do a new arrangement for some other group, or let's say you've got to rewrite it for a smaller orchestra or something weird like that, then yeah, you can go back and do that. But otherwise, it's not actually necessary, I think, to go back and make changes to your earlier stuff. I think it's better to keep moving forward. So, yeah, I see your question here. It's absolutely normal to spend more than 5 hours on a short piece. With something even like a little commercial, if you're doing something for film scoring, or even if you're just writing a little classical piece or a little piece just to put up on SoundCloud, it could take you all day, doing a composition, and then especially if you move into doing a proper mock-up or doing a good recording of it, could take you even longer. But I spend, when I'm doing film scoring, I spend the vast majority of my time in Sibelius. Actually, I'll figure out my time, how I lay out my measures and things like that, and the tempo map in Digital Performer, so that I can get sheet music to write off of. I'll usually write by hand and then move into Sibelius, and I spend most of my time in Sibelius fine-tuning and crafting things all over the place. So 5 hours is not an abnormal thing for even a short piece. And I would say, as an exercise for you, because it sounds like you probably feel comfortable moving through pieces quickly. You write something, you move on, you write something, you move on. Maybe as an exercise, slow it down. Write something and come back to it the next day, spend an hour on it. Come back next day, spend 2 or 3 hours on it. Figure out how can you expand it a little bit more, make it something a little bit more in depth. And I think you'll probably be pleasantly surprised. My favorite time composing absolutely is the fine-tuning period, because you're past the initial I don't know what I'm going to write. I don't know if what I write is going to sound good, and I don't know how I'm going to make it to the end. You get past that period. That's like the uncomfortable, not fun period of composition. It's this like nugging your way through all these measures, right? But if you get to a point where you say, I think this could be a complete piece, this is it. I've reached a final measure, I've cadenced, I've done whatever, and now you get to spend the time really making it shine. I find that actually is the most fun aspect of composition, next to getting your stuff performed. But if you're going to get it performed, you absolutely want to spend that time on your piece, because that's what makes the difference. Looking at each individual part, looking at what is this player going to be thinking about when they play. If you're writing for piano, finding things that work, but maybe could work better. If you've written a chord, right? Maybe it'll sound better as that, in that kind of spread on the chord, or maybe it, right? Playing around with those little kind of details, and that only happens once you get to know your piece and you've kind of spent some time doing it. So. Okay, let's see. Kickstani had some little comments here. Thanks for the answers. Can't wait to hang out on another stream. Yeah, I enjoy the symposiums, and yeah, be sure to subscribe. And I think if you're subscribed, you get notifications when I go live. So I'm thinking about doing some more live shows. Some live composition periods where I'll actually compose. I mean, I do compose live here on the symposiums, but I'm thinking about doing a little bit more structured, coming to the table with some ideas and then working them out where everybody can ask me questions. Yeah, and then you had another comment here about killing off your creative babies. Yeah, that's what it's about. It's being okay with letting go of good material, because this is the reality, is that you're not going to run dry. The well is not going to run dry unless you stop getting input. But it's not, as long as you're still listening to music and doing things that keep you going emotionally and creatively, going to movies, looking at art, reading books, listening to music, exercising, playing, having fun in life, if you're doing that kind of stuff, creatively, you're not going to run out of ideas. And so you have to be okay with getting rid of ideas, because if it really is that good of an idea, it will surface again. I mean, these things that you really like, these sounds, these progressions, right? That kind of progression, it just sounds cool. I just really like the sound of it, and I find it creeps into my music quite often. Another one that I do, let's see, it would be... this kind of Lydian sound on the 4th scale degree, right? I use that all the time. It's a sound that I really like. So if I have that in a piece and I'm like, you know what, I've used that a couple times, I'm going to kill it, because if it's that good, it's going to show up in another thing and I don't have to worry about it. Let's see. ABC saying he thinks he needs to, or he or she, I'm not sure who this, but they think they need to learn more about Sibelius note entry. Yes, I would say, this is probably the last thing I'm going to talk about, but know your software. A huge creativity killer. Morton Lordson, yeah, I see that. I love Morton Lordson's music. If you haven't listened to his choral music, listen to his stuff. Sorry, there was a comment here about the Morton Lordson effect. I guess that's this. That's funny. I like that. The Morton Lordson effect. I was talking about software. Know your software as best as you can, and the core aspects of your software. So with Sibelius, obviously, note entry, is critical. And if you don't know how to do certain things in your software, it is going to kill your creativity. Absolutely. So which is one of the reasons why I like to get basic ideas, initial sketching. I like to do that by hand, because the only software that you're dealing with at that point is your brain. And everybody should be working on their brain software and learning how to compose, by hand a little bit, so you understand the core fundamentals away from anything. You shouldn't need, fancy sample libraries and amazing notation software to write good music, because for hundreds of years, nobody had any of that stuff. So spend the time, get into the manual, get on the Facebook groups, get into the forums, read Sibelius, or it's called the Sibelius blog, whatever it's called now, like notation something, or I can't remember what it's called. They changed the name on it, but really learn that stuff well, and it'll pay off. Let's see, one more thing here. After learning 4 voice leading, counterpoint, basic harmony theory, where do you go next in terms of harmony? Start stealing chord progressions. In a sense, harmony is there's a lot of cool stuff out there that everybody uses all the time, and I would just say try to pick up some of those progressions. Whatever, kind of how we started off earlier. If you hear a progression or you hear a chordal movement that you really like, write it down, figure it out. Figure it out by ear or whatever. Look at the score for it. Try to pull it out, and you'll start to build up that storehouse of things that you go to. It's like your muscle memory, right? It's your craft. It's the stuff that is going to work. And then also start experimenting with it, So don't be afraid to, even if you're only comfortable with diatonic harmony, use some polychords, right? Use that stuff because it sounds cool. You can try it out. If it doesn't work, get rid of it. If it works, keep it, however you want to do it. Look into the Partimenti. Listen to that Partimenti, the episode with Robert Yerdingen from the podcast. I think it was really good. And if anybody hasn't been up there, and I need to post these on Patreon as well, but I did an interview with Samuel Adler and William Kaplan. I would say the other core aspect of harmony, and what's lost in a lot of harmony training, is that it's intimately connected with form. And it's something that's not really talked about very much is the harmonic pacing, right? This how many chords you have per measure. When do you speed up? When do you slow down? Start to analyze pieces of music, not just know how to write a chord progression, but actually look at the music that you like, analyze the chords, and look at the harmonic movement. When is the composer using lots of chords? When are they modulating? When are they doing things? You know, if you start to get into bigger forms like sonata form, there's all sorts of tools and techniques that you use with the harmony. I mean, you've got different key areas. You've got the home key. You've got subordinate key. You've got development keys. You need to know when and why you should be using them. Using these, when you should be going, when should you do a cadence, when shouldn't you do a cadence. There's a lot to learn, but it's connected and rooted in the real music. And the best way to do this, ear transcription, copy music out by hand, take that stuff that you've copied and abstract it out. So turn it into a bass line and a simple soprano line, take out all the ornamentation and details, you know, use that to write your own theme and variations on. Write a theme based off of that stuff, and then do variations on those themes. You'll start to pick up this stuff really well. So yeah, okay, so we're about an hour here. If you are interested in learning composition, absolutely check out artofcomposing.com. I've got 2 full-length courses. I've got the fundamentals. I teach everything that I talk about here. I teach you how to use harmony, how to write chord progressions, how to use form, how to write themes in small ternative form, sentences, periods, and how it all comes together. I teach you how to write melodies in a very simple way, chord tone melodies, and then how to embellish those melodies. And I also talk a lot about writing melodies from the perspective of scales, because that in itself is kind of a different subject. There are tendency tones within scales, right? There are certain notes that want to go somewhere. And if you pay attention to those notes, you can actually write a really cool melody with not a whole lot of effort. Right? I'm just following the tendencies of things to go. And there's ways to break those tendencies. This is stuff I go over all the time in the course, and I highly recommend it. Music Composition 101 on artofcomposing.com. And then the 201 course is sonata form. If you go through the 101 course, you're going to love sonata form. And if you're not ready, if you don't understand what I talk about, probably not quite ready for the sonata form course, because it's about how to write pieces, 4 or 5 minutes long. So check it out, artofcomposing.com. Thanks everybody for showing up tonight, and I will see you all next. Actually, let me think. I think it's next Saturday. It should be next Saturday, 11 a.m. Unless something changes, I will let you know. But next Saturday, 11 a.m. on YouTube. And thanks, Kikastani, for the super chat. Anybody who wants to help me out here, that's very useful for me. And let me know if you've got other ideas or things you want to be seeing in the symposiums, and if you'd like to see more symposiums. Or live composition sessions, things like that. So I will talk to you later. See you next week at 11 a.m. on Saturday. 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time.